I recently got a job at a funeral home. But there are strange rules that must be followed. You never really think your life can hit rock bottom until it does. My name is Ethan Miller, and a year ago, I thought I had everything under control. I was a 22-year-old biology student at the University of Maine, had a part-time job at a diner, and a girlfriend who I thought was my forever. Then it all unraveled like a bad dream that just kept going. First, I lost my job. The diner shut down without warning, leaving me scrambling to pay my rent. Then my girlfriend, Rachel, decided she needed space, which is just code for I've moved on. And as if the universe wasn't done with me yet, my mom passed away from a sudden stroke a month later. She was my last remaining family. That left me alone, broke, and drowning in a pit of despair so deep I wasn't sure I'd ever climb out. When my mom died, the little money she had went to cover her funeral expenses. I could barely process my grief as I sat in the office of Graves & Sons Funeral Home, signing paperwork and pretending to understand what the director was telling me. I was too numb to care about the details, the casket, the flowers, the service. It all blurred together in a haze of cheap coffee and stale air. That's when I met Mr. Edward Graves. He was tall and thin, with a face so pale it almost blended into the white collar of his impeccably tailored suit. His gray eyes seemed to see right through me as he sat across from me, explaining the costs. He spoke softly, almost kindly, but there was a weight to his words that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "I understand this is a difficult time for you, Mr. Miller," he said, his hands folded neatly on the desk. "Losing a parent can be destabilizing, to say the least." "You could say that again," I muttered, staring at the floor. "Forgive me if this is too forward," he continued, "but I couldn't help overhearing you mention your current financial situation. We're always looking for reliable help here at Graves & Sons. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady. If you're interested, I'd be happy to offer you a position." At first, I thought he was joking. Who offers a job at a funeral home to someone who's clearly a grieving mess? But the look in his eyes told me he was serious. Dead serious. I hesitated. The idea of working around corpses sent a chill down my spine. But what choice did I have? My savings were gone, and I couldn't keep asking friends to cover me for groceries. I needed money, and I needed it fast. What kind of work are we talking about?" I asked cautiously. "Mostly cleaning, setting up for services, and helping maintain the grounds. You'd never be alone during the more delicate procedures," he said, his tone neutral. "I'll warn you, it's not for everyone. But it's honest work, and it pays well." "I guess I could give it a try," I said reluctantly, already regretting the words as they left my mouth. Mr. Graves nodded, a ghost of a smile tugging at his thin lips. "Excellent. Be here tomorrow at 7 p.m. sharp. And, Ethan," he paused, locking eyes with me. "This is a family business. We have rules. Follow them, and you'll do just fine." I should have walked away right then and there. But I didn't. I needed the money, and I was too tired to care about what I was getting myself into. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to that small, nagging voice in the back of my head screaming at me to run. For the first few days, the job was uneventful, if not a little unsettling. Cleaning the viewing room, arranging chairs, and dusting the rows of coffins stacked in the storage room became routine. But it wasn't the work that got to me, it was the oppressive silence of the place. Every creak of the floorboards or distant hum of machinery set my nerves on edge. By the end of my first week, I had convinced myself that Mr. Graves' warning about the coffins was just his way of hazing the new guy. After all, nothing strange had happened. At least, not until the night I stayed late to clean the viewing room after a large service. It was almost midnight, and the funeral home was quieter than usual. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above me as I wiped down the podium and adjusted the chairs. I was halfway through mopping the floor when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the corner of the room where an ornate, half-closed coffin stood on display. I froze, gripping the mop handle tightly. My first thought was that the sound was my imagination playing tricks on me. But then the tapping came again, louder this time, like someone drumming their fingers against the wood. My chest tightened, and Mr. Graves' warning echoed in my mind, "Never open a coffin. If you hear anything coming from inside, ignore it. It isn't real." I stared at the coffin, my heart pounding. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. "Just ignore it." But then the tapping turned into something else. A voice. A faint, muffled whisper seeping through the cracks of the coffin lid. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but as I strained to listen, they grew clearer. "Ethan, help me, please." The sound of my name being called from inside the coffin made my blood run cold. It wasn't possible. I took a shaky step back, my mind racing. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Logic told me it had to be a trick, maybe a hidden speaker or some leftover prank from an earlier service. But another part of me, the part that was terrified and desperate for answers, couldn't let it go. I inched closer to the coffin, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stop. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the coffin shook, the lid rattling as if something inside was struggling to get out. "Please, let me out," the voice pleaded, louder now, more desperate. I couldn't think. My hands were shaking as I reached for the lid, the warning forgotten in the haze of panic and adrenaline. I told myself I'd just take a quick look, just enough to prove to myself that it was nothing. My fingers gripped the edge of the lid, and with one quick motion, I lifted it. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. Inside the coffin lay a decaying corpse, its hollow eyes staring straight at me. The skin was gray and sunken, peeling away in places to reveal dark, rotting flesh beneath. Its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, and as I stared in horror, it moved. The corpse's head jerked toward me, and a sickening gurgle escaped its throat. Dirt spilled from its mouth, and the scent of rot and decay filled the air. I stumbled backward, the lid slipping from my fingers and slamming shut. The whispers returned, louder and angrier this time, echoing through the room like a chorus of voices. I ran. I didn't stop to clean up, didn't even grab my jacket. I bolted out of the viewing room and down the hall, my footsteps pounding against the hardwood floors. As I passed the storage room, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the stacks of coffins. But I didn't dare look. I just kept running. By the time I reached the front office, I was out of breath and shaking. My hands fumbled for my phone, and I dialed Mr. Graves' number with trembling fingers. It rang twice before he picked up, his voice calm and steady as if he'd been expecting my call. "You opened it, didn't you?" he said, his tone devoid of surprise. I could barely speak. I didn't mean to, it was calling my name. I thought. "It doesn't matter what you thought," he interrupted, his voice sharp now. "Listen to me carefully. There is a list of instructions in the desk drawer. Follow them exactly. Do not skip a single step, and no matter what you hear or feel, do not open your eyes. Do you understand?" "Why, yeah," I stammered, my mind racing. "But what happens if?" "Just follow the instructions, Ethan," he said firmly. "And pray it works." The line went dead, leaving me standing there, clutching the phone, with the weight of my mistakes settling over me like a suffocating blanket. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to open the desk drawer in the front office. Inside, I found a folded piece of paper with the words "Emergency Protocol" written across the top in Mr. Graves' neat, old-fashioned handwriting. I unfolded it and scanned the instructions, my stomach twisting tighter with every line. "Return to the room with the coffin immediately. Do not hesitate. Take the holy water from the cabinet in the room. As soon as you find it and take it, close your eyes. With your eyes closed, pour the holy water over the coffin. Do not open your eyes under any circumstances. I stared at the paper, my mind racing. The thought of going back into that room made my chest tighten, but Mr. Graves' voice echoed in my head, "Just follow the instructions, Ethan. And pray it works." I gripped the paper in one hand and forced my legs to move. The hallway seemed longer than it had before, stretching endlessly toward the door to the viewing room. The weight of the air grew heavier as I approached, as though something on the other side was pulling me in. With a deep, shaky breath, I twisted the handle and stepped inside. The air hit me like a wall, thick, suffocating, and reeking of rot and damp earth. The whispers started almost immediately, faint at first but growing louder with every step. I didn't dare look directly at the coffin, but I could feel its presence, pulsing with a dark, malevolent force. The cabinet was near the far wall, just a few feet from the coffin. Every step toward it felt heavier, as if the room itself was fighting me. The whispers turned into garbled voices, some pleading, others mocking, and one low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. I reached the cabinet and yanked it open. Thankfully, it wasn't locked. Inside was the small glass bottle labeled holy water. My hands closed around it tightly, the cool glass a small comfort against the growing heat of the room. I took a deep breath and followed the next step in the instructions. I shut my eyes tightly, pressing my free hand over them for good measure. With my eyes closed, I turned back toward the coffin. The whispers intensified, rising into a cacophony of screams and moans. My outstretched hand groped for the edge of the coffin, and when my fingers brushed against it, I nearly recoiled. The wood was cold, damp, and slick with something slimy. My hand slipped over what felt like clumps of hair, and I had to bite back a scream. I uncorked the bottle and tilted it, letting the water splash onto the coffin. The reaction was immediate. The whispers turned into shrieks, high-pitched and guttural, as the coffin bucked violently under my hand. A wet, ripping sound filled the room, followed by the unmistakable scent of burning flesh. The stench was overpowering, and I gagged, my stomach lurching as bile rose in my throat. Then something grabbed my wrist. My entire body froze as icy fingers clamped around my wrist, impossibly strong and cold as death itself. I tried to jerk my hand away, but the grip tightened, pinning me to the coffin. My breath hitched, and I struggled to keep my eyes shut as the whispers rose to a deafening roar. "Stop," a voice hissed, barely audible over the din. It was low, raspy, and inhuman, sending shivers down my spine. The hand holding the bottle trembled violently as I fought to keep pouring the holy water. "Let go!" I shouted, my voice cracking. My own voice sounded small and distant against the chaos around me. The stench in the room grew unbearable, a choking miasma of decay and sulfur that burned my throat and nose. I gasped for air, but the rancid smell filled my lungs, making me cough and gag. My knees buckled, and I nearly collapsed. Somehow, I forced myself to keep pouring. The holy water hissed and sizzled as it hit the coffin, and the grip on my wrist suddenly loosened. I stumbled back, almost dropping the bottle as the whispers turned into a single, blood-curdling scream. It felt as if the sound was coming from inside my own skull, rattling my thoughts and leaving me disoriented. Then I felt it, something crawling out my arm. It was wet and slimy, slithering over my skin like a living shadow. I shook my arm violently, trying to fling it off, but it clung to me with a vice-like grip. My breathing grew ragged, panic clawing at my chest as I fought to stay upright. The bottle slipped from my fingers, shattering on the floor with a sharp crack. The crawling sensation abruptly stopped. The room went silent. I stood there, trembling, my hands still clamped over my eyes. The air was heavy with the stench of burning flesh and sulfur, but the oppressive force that had filled the room was gone. My body felt like it had been wrung out, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and felt my way back to the door, my movements clumsy and desperate. My fingers found the handle, and with a desperate shove, I forced it open and staggered into the hallway. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the whispers vanished. I collapsed against the wall, clutching my arm where the shadow had been. My skin was ice cold, but there was no mark, no sign of what had just happened. The empty bottle lay shattered behind the door, a silent testament to the nightmare I had just endured. Mr. Graves' warning had been clear, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of what I'd just experienced. Whatever was in that coffin, it wasn't human anymore. If it ever had been. I don't know how long I sat there in the hallway, slumped against the cold wall with the empty bottle still clutched in my trembling hands. My heart was pounding in my ears, drowning out the silence that had settled over the funeral home. The heavy, oppressive weight that had filled the viewing room seemed to have lifted, but I could still feel a faint trace of it lingering in the air, like the smell of smoke after a fire. I finally forced myself to stand, my legs shaky and unsteady beneath me. I leaned against the wall for support and took a few deep breaths, trying to collect my thoughts. Every fiber of my being wanted to bolt out the front door and never come back, but I knew I couldn't leave just yet. I had to call Mr. Graves. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed his number. It rang twice before he answered, his voice calm and measured as always. "Ethan. Is it done?" "I think so," I croaked, my throat dry and raw. I poured the holy water. The noises stopped, but... "Mr. Graves, what the hell was in that coffin?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mr. Graves finally spoke, his tone was grave. "You did what needed to be done. That's all you need to know." I wanted to press him for answers, but something in his voice told me it would be pointless. Instead, I nodded, realizing belatedly that he couldn't see me. "Okay," I whispered. "What now?" "Go home, Ethan. Get some rest. You've earned it." Before I could respond, he hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand for a long moment, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. I wanted to believe that it was over, but a part of me knew better. Whatever had been in that coffin, it wasn't something you could just forget. I stumbled toward the front door, my body heavy with exhaustion. As I passed the barred shop window, I made the mistake of glancing inside. The viewing room was dark now, but something moved in the shadows. My breath hitched as I caught a glimpse of a figure, pale and decayed, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. It stood motionless, watching me through the glass. I didn't wait to see if it would move. I turned and ran, bursting out into the cold night air. The wind bit at my face, but I didn't care. I kept running until I reached my car, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My hands fumbled with the keys as I started the engine, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the funeral home. When I finally got home, I collapsed onto my bed, still fully clothed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the window, its glowing eyes boring into me. I tossed and turned for hours, haunted by the memory of that night. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Graves. It was brief and to the point. "Payment has been transferred. Thank you for your service." I checked my bank account and saw a deposit that was far more than I'd expected. It should have been enough to make me feel relieved, even grateful. Instead, it made my stomach churn. No amount of money could erase what I'd seen, what I'd felt in that room. I never went back to Graves & Sons. Mr. Graves didn't ask me to, and I didn't offer. The money was enough to keep me afloat for a while, but it came at a cost. Even now, months later, I can still feel the weight of that night hanging over me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll wake up and swear I can hear faint whispers in the darkness. And every now and then, when I pass by a darkened window, I catch a glimpse of something pale and hollow-eyed staring back at me.